Welcome to episode 489 of the Brainy Business, understanding the psychology of why people buy. In today's episode, I'm excited to introduce you to Dr. Rosalind Chow. Ready? Let's get started.
You are listening to the Brainy Business Podcast, where we dig into the psychology of why people buy and help you incorporate behavioral economics into your business, making it more brain-friendly. Now here's your host, Melina Palmer.
Hello, everyone. My name is Melina Palmer, and I want to welcome you to the Brainy Business Podcast. What doors have been opened for you throughout your life and career? How did those doors shape the experience you have today? And how often have you opened doors for others? That could be leaving the door open once you've walked through, but it's also that intentional experience of using whatever influence you have to open a door for someone else. It may feel like you can only do that once you've risen high enough in your organization, like you need more power and status to help others. But that isn't the case. There are always doors you can open. And the great news is they can help you along the way as well. I'm excited to talk more about this in today's conversation with Rosalind Chow. Rosalind is an associate professor of organizational behavior and theory at Carnegie Mellon University, where she studies the power of social hierarchy and its impact on diversity and inclusion efforts within organizations. Her new book, The Doors You Can Open, distinguishes the concept of sponsorship from mentorship, a concept I absolutely love and am so excited to share with you today. We also talk about the difference between power and status, proper ways to think about networking, and more. It's such a great discussion. I can't wait to jump right in. Last thing before we get into the conversation, I want to be sure you know that there are links in the show notes for my top related past episodes and books, ways to get in touch with Rosalind and myself, and more. It's all within the app you're listening to and at thebrainybusiness.com/489. Now let's jump right in. Dr. Rosalind Chow, welcome to the Brainy Business Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I'm so excited to be chatting with you today. Loved your book. It has such great insights in it. We'll, of course, dive into that in a moment here. But for everyone who doesn't yet know you, can you share a little bit about yourself and the work that you do?
Sure. So I am an associate professor of organizational behavior and theory at Carnegie Mellon University. I study topics related to power and status, social hierarchies, normally within the context of different social inequalities like racial differences or gender differences. And I got tired of publishing papers about those topics and wanted to focus more on things we could do to reduce the inequalities that we see around us. And that led me to my interest in sponsorship. And that's what the book is about.
Oh, great. Well, I'm intrigued by the, like you said, you got tired of writing papers on it and so decided to make a shift. Can you share a little bit more about what you mean by kind of that experience?
Sure. So a lot of my earlier papers are about, you could say in a way, like the inevitability of social inequality and social hierarchy, because it's one of the most natural ways of organizing social behavior. And so for a lot of us, it actually is helpful to know who's in charge, who's not in charge, who we should pay attention to, all of those things. The problem is that oftentimes the cues that we're using to make those decisions are aligned with other characteristics that actually should have no bearing on our decision on who should be in charge and who should be following. So I've published a lot on those sorts of dynamics around who tends to rise to the top in groups, different social groups, and how they try to maintain their positions within social hierarchies. But again, all of that is really about the persistence and the maintenance of unequal social systems, and really not much is out there on how you can actively dismantle those unequal systems. So that was the impetus for wanting to move in a slightly different direction.
Right, right. And a very valuable one. And like, instead of just talking about what's wrong, like, let's step back a little bit and see what we can do to change. So just for those who aren't as familiar with the field and the research that does exist there, can you share where you said there are some, who does tend to kind of rise into some of these powerful positions, and where you said it's for maybe peripheral reasons or things that aren't as important? Like, what are some of those qualities or things that come into play that tends, as, human nature, that certain people that we kind of sort in this way?
Sure. I think the most obvious one is to point to is physical cues. So often the person who talks most in a group is the one who tends to emerge as the informal leader, and are chosen by others to be leaders. And that's because we have this unspoken association between confidence and competence. But in reality, that relationship is not very strong. Yeah. And so it's a problem of relying on these proxies for these underlying qualities that are harder to evaluate because we're just cognitively lazy creatures.
Definitely. Well, and I have a whole episode on the Dunning-Kruger effect as far as the confidence competence problem kind of goes into play there for sure. So, so then as your work has kind of evolved here, and like you said, you went into sponsorship. Can you share a little bit? I of course know from reading the book what you're talking about, but can you share for people kind of what that means and why it matters?
Sure. I mean, I think the first thing I want to mention is that a lot of people don't know what it means, or if they do, they have a different association with it than I intend. So a lot of people know about sponsorship in the context of, say, sports sponsorships or immigration sponsorship, right? Like, so for you to have a successful application to immigrate somewhere, typically you need a person in that home country to be willing to sponsor you. You also have sponsorship in the context of like work visas. So there's also the sponsorship idea from, Alcoholics Anonymous, which is not how we're thinking about sponsorship here at all. So sponsorship, in the way that I think about it, is it's a form of typically professional support, but really just any kind of social support could fall into the category of sponsorship. But it's any support that you give to someone where, instead of trying to change the person that you're trying to help, you're not trying to change who they are. You're trying to change the social environment around them. And so a type of, or a form of sponsorship that a lot of people are very familiar with are like letters of recommendation or referrals, where somebody's writing on your behalf, saying nice things about you, encouraging other people to treat you a particular way. That would be sponsorship, and not to be confused with mentorship, where the mentor is actually trying to change the mentee, right? So this is where, like, the teacher who's writing you a letter of recommendation is actually telling the student, hey, you need to do more of X, Y, and Z. So that would be mentorship. But them writing the letter of recommendation to the college and saying, hey, this student is great for ABC reasons, that would be sponsorship.
Definitely. And it's, I was, of course, going to ask about the mentorship connection. So glad that you brought that up here. And I think that's something that people maybe think about a little bit more formally, right? As far as a lot of companies have their sort of required, whether they're as well planned out or not, but like a mentorship program inside of an organization is more common than a sponsorship type of a program. Though I do believe, you talked about in the book that there are at least some companies that are trying to bring that together. And so, good to kind of see and think about the differences here. I think there's a reason that you started with it early in the book, but the example with Derek Jeter is a really good example of kind of what this can look like. Can you share a little bit about that story?
Sure. So this is, well, I guess it's a story of Derek Jeter. It's also the story of Kim
right.
Hang.
It's a story of a thing that he did one time.
Right.
That was really helpful. So fair enough. Yes.
So Kim Hang, starting with Kim Hang, she was the general manager for the Marlins, and she is possibly more famous or most famous for being the first female GM in Major League Baseball, and in all four kind of major league or, major American sport leagues. And the question has always been, why did it take her so long? Because she was probably ready to be a GM like 10 years before she actually was selected to be one. And it wasn't until Derek Jeter actually became a co-owner of the Marlins, and he had worked with Kim Hang when they were together at the Yankees, and he basically vouched for her to the other people in the club, and she was finally able to get her dream job of being a general manager. I like starting off with that story because I think it makes it so clear how what Derek Jeter did was sponsorship and not mentorship. So if he had been mentoring Kim Hang, that would have taken the form of talking to her and saying, hey, when you interview, these are the qualifications you want to play up. Or this is something that the team is really concerned about. So as you prepare, make sure you have an answer for these types of questions. Right. So really trying to change something about Kim Hang. So that would have counted as mentorship, but that's actually not what he did at all. He didn't give her any coaching for that interview. He was already very well acquainted with her qualifications. He knew she was going to do well on her own. The main thing was just making sure that she would say yes to the opportunity of interviewing for the position. And then I'm sure once they finished that process, he probably advocated very strongly for them to hire her.
Mm-hmm. Right. And like you said, potentially it's, I believe it was, so he reached out to her and said, hey, if I put your name up, would you be open to this sort of, trying for
right.
it? Of which I'm sure it's like, yes, please. Like, I've been trying to get this job for a long time.
What was funny about that though, and I think this is actually a really interesting thing that I don't talk about as much in the book, because the book is more for people who are going to be sponsors. But there's this interesting interplay between being sponsored as well. And so if you look into the interviews that Kim Hang did at that time, she talks about how nervous she is to be interviewing for the Marlins because it's Derek Jeter. And basically she's putting herself in a situation where she might get denied or rejected. And that has implications for her relationship with this person that I imagine she feels fairly close with and trusts. And that would be a hard thing to have happen in a relationship. Right.
Yeah.
So you have to feel pretty certain, I guess, as a protege, if you're going to say yes to these types of opportunities, because obviously it's an opportunity to shine, but it also is potentially an opportunity where things might not go very well. And it's going to look bad for you. It's going to look bad for your sponsor, and it's going to damage your relationship with them.
Right. And so I think that, takes us nicely into the, question of, if someone was going to choose to be a sponsor, there's risk in that, right? And in the way that, being a mentor, which is so important. I am a big, advocate of mentorship, as I'm sure you are as well, right? And with this, it's people need mentors and they also need sponsors. And knowing that, but as a mentor, I can be giving you advice. You do what you're going to do with it. And it's there's a wall that you can kind of put up between that. Whereas a sponsor is like, I'm putting my name, my reputation on the line, right? That's in the same way of like, not a professional reference for everyone sort of a deal. And even being a reference where someone can call me is different than I'm going out of my way, actively, proactively paving a way for someone else and doing what I can to make that happen. It could feel like there's a lot of, risk in that. It could be scary for some people. What thoughts do you have on that as far as advice too of like why it's worth it, even if it does feel a little scary?
Well, so thank you for talking through that, because I think that's actually a really important part of what I want people to take away from the book, which is a lot of times people think of sponsorship as this like yes, no category of behavior. Am I going to sponsor someone or not? And I think what you're pointing to is actually that sponsorship is a continuum of different types of behavior. So yes, maybe I'm willing to act as a referral for someone, but how far I'm willing to go, that changes the amount of personal risk that I'm taking on. So you can always sponsor if you want. It's just that how you choose to do it will like strengthen the association that people have in their minds between you and the person you're sponsoring. So if you want to play it really safe, you just, you co-sign on the things you feel especially certain about, right? So that would be like, oh, Melina won this award for her podcast. That is irrefutable, verifiable evidence that no one is going to be able to like say is wrong. That's a very safe thing to be putting out there into the world as a sponsor. But on the other hand, if I were to say, I think Melina is so great that she is going to win these podcast awards, and that's why you should be paying attention to her. That's in the future. It's uncertain. You don't know. So your willingness to state that sort of outcome with more certainty kind of puts you more on the hook for if things don't go as you predict. So you can kind of choose how much you want to predict into the future for the other person. And so if you feel scared about sponsoring, you can always just stick with what you know to be true. And that is super low risk and still a way to be a sponsor. That doesn't answer your other question of like, well, why should you sponsor if like it's so risky? So if you're a really good sponsor, meaning, you make good calls, people trust you, they take your recommendations, they end up working with the people you recommend, and they see that lo and behold, this person really is wonderful. It's not just that your protege gets a boost. It's like in the future, they're going to pay even more attention to the recommendations that you are going to be giving out. And so that's great for a couple of reasons. One, because you have more influence. But the other reason it's really great is because, I like to think of sponsorship as a way to connect problems with solutions. And the more of us who can do that, the better it is for everyone. So if you know people that other people should know, it's really much better if you're willing to make those connections happen than if you shy away from, introducing people to each other, for instance.
Right. Well, and for everyone now that's thinking, okay, yes, and, but I'm not Derek Jeter, right? So like, who am I? What am I supposed to do? What do I have here? Can you share a little bit about, power and status and whether can everyone be a sponsor, even if we don't have we would say we don't have those things yet.
Yeah. So, this is also a really important distinction to be making. So a lot of people think that the only people who can sponsor others are people who have lots of power. So we would think of Derek Jeter as someone who has a lot of power because in that situation, he's a co-owner and CEO of the Marlins. So he clearly has a lot of decision-making power. But the most effective sponsorship isn't necessarily coming from power. It's coming from status. So I'm a social psychologist by training. In social psychology, we like to distinguish between power and status. Power is what we call a control over resources that other people want. And status is the admiration and respect that other people have for you. So I like to think of this as you can exert influence by compelling other people to do what you want, or by getting them to want to do it themselves. And so power allows you to compel, but status basically makes other people want to do it for you of their own volition. So you're not forcing them to do it. They just want to do it. And that's because we trust people who have status. So we don't actually necessarily trust people who have power. If anything, I think many of us have a negative association with people who have power. We typically tend to think that our interactions with them are not going to go very well. They're not very friendly. But that's not true for people who have status. And so sponsorship works best when it comes from a person with status. And what I would say to readers is that you always have status in somebody's eyes, not necessarily within, your organization. You might not feel like you have a lot of power, but you probably have at least one or two people who trust your judgment and would take your advice if you were to give it to them. And that's trust that you can leverage into sponsoring someone else, because sponsorship, in a way, I like to think of it as trust transitivity. So if you trust me and I trust this person and then think they're great, then you should also trust that person. And I assure you that you're going to think they're great too. Right. And so for those people who think they don't have a lot of power, you want to start thinking less about power, more about trust. And then if it's really daunting to you, just focus on the positive stuff, right? So I call it good gossip. Good gossip is always a low-hanging fruit for all of us to engage in. And it actually seems to help everyone when we share good gossip, because now other people are aware of who's good at what. But you also get kudos for being the kind of person who pays attention to what other people are doing and the good that other people are doing. So you're paying attention to the positives, the contributions that other people are making, and you seem very what we would call other focused, right? You're not self-promoting, you're promoting, but you're promoting somebody else, which is a very selfless kind of action. And it's a great way to show that you care about the group, to help somebody else, to make it more obvious. Like if there's someone in the group who has a problem, that this person would be good to, would be helpful to help solve their problem. Like now you have that information. It's what we call like a win-win-win situation for everyone.
Yeah, definitely. So as we expand a little bit on the idea of good gossip, is it just that we, instead of saying, oh my gosh, did you see what Melina was wearing yesterday? Yuck, right? Sort of gossip, instead of something like that, is more like, oh my gosh, did you hear, Melina just won this award on this thing or whatever, right? Like that, and, or is it, where does this tie into the idea of just even being a connector, right? As far as I heard this job is available, I'm going to tell them about this person, like it's gossiping that someone's, good about something or that you heard about a job role, like what all falls into the category if people are looking to channel their need to connect and gossip in a positive way. What would that look like?
I mean, we do it all the time, really. It's just not necessarily about specific individuals. Like we don't see it that way. So for instance, if you were talking to someone and they're like, I'm feeling really bored. I don't know how I just don't have a lot of intellectual stimulation in my life right now. Like, let's imagine that's their problem. Okay. So that's their problem. And so then maybe what you could do is you would say, okay, well, the way that I manage that problem is I listen to a bunch of podcasts. So let me tell you about all the podcasts that I find really interesting. And here's this one by Melina Palmer, right? And you should listen to the Brainy Business because that one really captures my attention and breaks things down in a way that makes me feel intellectually stimulated. So here is someone expressing that they have a problem. They're unaware of the solutions available, and you're essentially just helping them make that connection. So that would be an easy one. In the workplace, this typically manifests as like, oh, you have this problem or you have this question. I don't necessarily know the answer to that question, or I don't have the capacity to help you with this thing right now. But I know someone else who can answer that question or who does have capacity and would be a really great fit for this sort of opportunity.
Right. Yeah. So making those sort of connections and helping, so when you were coming up with those suggestions there, I definitely was thinking about, later in the book, you talk a little bit about listening and like actually really deeply listening. And I think it was so interesting to read about your examples because we hear all the time that you should be a better listener and be an active listener. And it's like, okay, fine. But the exercise you talk about in the book is one that I found very interesting. Can you share a little bit about that?
It's one of my favorite exercises. And I will give credit where credit is due. My colleague, Nathan Pettit, was the one who shared it with me. I don't know if there's an alternative originating author to the exercise. So in this exercise, the participants are paired off into, they're paired off in pairs. So there's two of them. They're sitting across the table from each other. And they have to answer a series of questions. But the kicker is that while one of them is speaking, the other one cannot respond. And there's 3 rounds of the exercise, and each round gets longer and longer. So the first round is 2 minutes long, then it's 5 minutes, and then it's 8 minutes. And each person, they switch back and forth between who is speaking and who's listening. And it's really hard for for the people in the exercise. Like the first 2 minutes are just agony for both of them, for both the speaker and the listener, because the speakers usually run out of things to say, and the listeners are like, "How am I supposed to engage in this conversation when I can't say anything?" Or depending on how I run it, I also don't let them make facial expressions either, which is really hard for a lot of people. But what's really magical is that as you go through the exercise, people kind of relax into it. So listeners, they realize, oh, well, if I'm not allowed to do anything, like I can't say anything in response, and I can do minimal facial expressions. So now, the the only thing I have to do is listen. And they find that they are just like they internalize a lot more of what the other person has to say. And the speakers, some students just never get over the fact that they have to spend so much time speaking. But there are other students who, they realize like, this person can't respond one way or the other. And so I don't have to pay attention to if they understand what I'm saying, if they care about what it is that I'm talking about. Like, I can just talk about whatever I want. And so they start spewing stuff. I like to call it verbal vomit. But they're like some really golden gems in the verbal vomit, right? Because it's the uncensored stuff that we normally don't share. And so after the exercise, I think what's really compelling is that, the students will always be like, that was the weirdest thing ever. Like, I don't want to ever do this again. But when you ask them, like, how close do you feel with the other person? How well do you feel like they know you? They all feel a lot closer to each other. There's usually some crying involved because someone starts sharing something that they didn't expect to share. People hug afterwards and they're like, I feel like I made a new best friend. I mean, the responses to the exercise can be really touching.
Well, and like you said with that, like, 2 minutes to just talk, I feel like I could do that, right? 8 is a lot, especially after I just talked for 2 and 5 minutes as you just sort of ramble. As a podcaster, I speak into the abyss a lot, so I'm sure I'd be okay on some of that. But it is, it's fascinating. And I know you, like you say in the book, is that it feels like to have a good conversation, to get to know people, this back and forth is required. And so showing that actually, if you just take the time to listen and hear what they're saying, that you can get to a deeper level than would have been possible if you're waiting for your turn to talk, right? If you're just looking to be able to speak.
Yeah. I think for me, the important thing for my students, but also for the readers, is that we actually guide our conversations in pretty significant ways both through our nonverbal behavior, but also in what we choose to respond to, right? About what the other person is saying. And a lot of times, we think of the most constructive conversations as one where both sides are contributing equally. But there's another version where what you give to the other person isn't your perspective, but really just space for them to articulate for themselves what is important and where they want to go. And you are just kind of this passenger in their self-exploration. So it's, if I had to give some advice, maybe, right, it's for the listeners who tend to like to solve other people's problems, like jump into problem solving mode right away when they hear the other person is struggling with something. Because sometimes it's not just, okay, what are you struggling with and how can I help you solve that? It's more important to understand why the thing that they're struggling with is, one, a struggle for them, but two, why that thing in particular compared to like anything else. And that is the kind of deeper information that I think many of us don't take the time or give other people the space to share with us.
Yeah. And so as we look to bring that, kind of full circle, how does this skill of being a better listener help as far as then being a sponsor? Like how does that come into play?
So I think of sponsors, again, like they're problem solvers. They're not just people, they're not just like PR people, right? You're like pushing out messages into the world. It's much more targeted if you're doing it right, because you're not looking to spam other people with positive gossip. You want to focus your sponsorship on the people who are actually looking for the solutions that you can offer, which are, the other people in your network. So I like you to think of it as being really good at identifying problems and really good at identifying potential solutions. And so when we think about people as having problems and being a good listener and understanding one, asking if they have struggles, because that's often something we don't necessarily ask about or people necessarily even share about. So that is part of why I talk so much about being a good listener. It's about being able to hear what the problems are and to understand it at a deeper level, so that when you can offer potential solutions in the form of sponsoring somebody else from your network, you have a higher likelihood of making a good match across those two people. But it's not just really understanding the problem, it's also really understanding the solution, right? So if you know somebody has a problem, you also need to know why that person in particular would be a good solution for that problem.
Right. And that just also made me think a bit about taking the time to ask, as far as those who become sponsored. You have the example of for Adobe and the guy that had created the different brushes, and where we think we don't have people or we're hesitant about asking sometimes. So just, I think, getting back to the side of someone who could be sponsored, knowing that people are out there. What's the little bit about that story, I guess, and then advice for people to, you don't know who you know and what they know and who they know.
Right. Yes, that's right. So just to briefly talk about that story. So this is a story of Kyle Webster, and he is an illustrator who actually invented these digital paint brushes. They're known as Kyle brushes. They became super popular, so much so that Adobe ended up acquiring them and now includes them as part of their tool set in Adobe Photoshop. So they're now very broadly available. And when Adobe first approached Kyle about purchasing his brush set, he realized that he had no idea how he was supposed to, how do you even know how much your brush set is worth? What are the terms you can ask for? He definitely you need a good lawyer, basically, is what it comes down to. So as an illustrator and not necessarily like a business person, he felt really stuck because his network was, and like many of us, his network was very composed of people who were very similar to him. So they were all also illustrators. And he was kind of like, okay, well, right now I don't need an illustrator. I need a lawyer, and I don't know any lawyers. I only know other illustrators. But he ended up kind of getting over himself and shouting, like an SOS into the ether and being like, okay, friends, I need a lawyer, please. Anyone know a lawyer? And as it turns out, at least one of his friends did know a lawyer who was perfectly qualified for this particular type of transaction. And so Kyle Webster was able to fulfill his dream of selling his brushes to Adobe. And the moral of the story there is that, one, you should ask for help when you need it, even if you're not sure, if the right person exists in your network. And I think the other thing that I would highlight here is a lot of people think about networking in terms of who you know directly. And that's a very simplistic way of thinking about networking. The more advanced way of thinking about networking is trying to figure out who the people you know. So it's the second order relationships that are actually really important for you to try and map out if you can. Because just like in Kyle Webster's case, he had no idea who all of his friends were connected to. And it turns out there were so many more resources in his network than he realized.
Yeah. And just taking that time to ask. I am a big advocate. I always talk about how, business and life, but business is a long game, right? And in this space of, give generously, give often. There's a reason we have be thoughtful kind of as the moral of the world here at the Brainy Business. And just, you don't know when you're going to need to ask for something, but also like what, 25 steps down the line is going to come back around in a positive way, and just, make the connection, see the thing, make the call, send the text, do the thing, right? And eventually, it'll all work itself out. But that's, so that is a big reason why your book and your work really appealed to me, of the, showing the science behind that, and that it's not just nice to do. There's actual a lot of really good value for other people too.
Absolutely. Yeah. That there's a way to network that doesn't have to be dirty is the way that I like to think about it, right? It's not about being super strategic and trying to plan out, okay, 5 years from now, I might meet this person, so I'm going to try and cultivate that relationship now.
Just even saying that, you go, ugh, no.
No, it's very much about just being super curious about what's going on with other people, and being willing to connect them to other things that might, other people that are going to expand their horizons.
Yeah, I love that. Well, I could talk to you all day, and we've already had so much of your valuable time as we pick, and we didn't get to talk about, Trusted 10 and so many amazing things from the book. But if you were going to take, and of course, everyone can go get their copy, so they can learn more about, what the doors they can open and what those things are we were talking about. But if you were going to share, one last thing as we kind of wrap up, what would you want people to know as they think about the work and the book and anything else?
Sure. So, I think we started off with me saying that anybody can be a sponsor, right? I think the other big takeaway that I would want readers to come away with is this idea that it's not about finding sponsors. So many of us are fixated on finding someone who can sponsor us, and more about being a sponsor, that the best way to find sponsors is to first sponsor other people. And once you start saying nice things about other people, those people are going to start saying some really nice things about you too.
Yeah. Love that. Right. The give first and no, it'll all come back. Right. Perfect. So, Rosalind, for everyone who is now so excited to, of course, get their copy of the book and to learn more and to follow you, connect, whatever else, we'll put links in the show notes, of course. But, what's their best path to do so?
So if you're actually a person who's super interested in social science, especially as it relates to business and management, I actually post fairly regularly on LinkedIn. So in true form, I don't really post about my own research, but what I do is I summarize other people's research, and I talk about what the practical implications are of the research for people who are working right in the corporate space. So you should follow me on LinkedIn if you're into social science work, and you can get the book at any of your favorite retailers, Amazon, Barnes and Noble. I personally prefer bookshop.org, but truly anywhere you normally get your books.
Yay. Wonderful. And I would say, what you're talking about that you share on LinkedIn feels very much in line with, the listener base of here at the Brainy Business. So I bet they will all be very excited about that. And we'll have links to your LinkedIn in the show notes as well. So thank you again, Rosalind. It was so great to chat with you today, and excited to have the book out in the world for everyone.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you again to Dr. Rosalind Chow for joining me on the show today. What got your brain buzzing in today's conversation? For me, I'm guessing it won't come as too much of a surprise to learn that I really liked the discussion on the difference between mentorship and sponsorship. I also like that we all have the opportunity to be a sponsor for someone else. You don't have to be at the top of any chain to be able to help others. You can sponsor someone right now, today. I sound like an infomercial, but the good news is sponsoring others is an investment that pays dividends, which very quickly can be monetary for you, even though your initial act doesn't have to cost you any money. Sponsoring people is an act of reciprocity, genuinely giving something to others without expectation of anything in return, but knowing that the universe has a way of repaying those who give first, give generously, and give often. Even if you don't think you have power, or you objectively don't have power, it doesn't mean that you don't have status. They're different. Status is a form of influence and something that everyone has. You have status in a group you're part of. It won't be in every group and situation, and that's okay. But who do you know that authentically supports you and listens to what you have to say? Where might you pass that on to another person who wants or needs access to that group? Where's the win-win for everyone? When you consider how many of these wins will be long-term, it's easy to make the case to do a little bit each day to sponsor or support someone else, to be a more thoughtful leader in life and in your organization, no matter what your role or title is. So what will you do today? Come share it with me on social media. I'd love to hear about it and spread the reciprocity around. You'll find me as the Brainy Biz pretty much everywhere and as Melina Palmer on LinkedIn. There are links to make it easy to connect with me in the show notes, which also have links to my top related past episodes and books, including The Doors You Can Open and more. It's all waiting for you in the app you're listening to and at thebrainybusiness.com/489. And thank you again to Rosalind Chow for joining me on the show today. It was a delight to chat with and learn from you. Join me Tuesday for another Brainy episode of the Brainy Business Podcast. It's going to be a lot of fun. You don't want to miss it. Until then, thanks again for listening and learning with me. And remember to be thoughtful.
Thank you for listening to the Brainy Business Podcast. Melina offers virtual strategy sessions, workshops, and other services to help businesses be more brain-friendly. For more free resources, visit thebrainybusiness.com.